For a mother, where is the line between love and enabling? For 68-year-old Amanda, a widow living in the shadow of grief, that line was crossed in the most intimate and horrific way imaginable. Her son Leo, spiraling into addiction after his father's death, had stolen everything he could from her. But when he commits one final, unforgivable act, stealing the 3 gold teeth from his mother's dentures as she slept, Amanda is forced to make an impossible choice. I want to start by giving a special shout out to my wonderful and loyal subscribers who are always with me in the comments. Today's shout out goes to Janet from Florida, Brenda from Ohio, and also to David, Michelle, and Charles. Your support means the world to me. Thank you for being here with me. My son stole my wedding ring, my television, and every spare dollar he could find in my house. But when he pried the 3 gold teeth from my dentures while I slept, the last gift my dying husband ever gave me, I knew that my love for him was no longer enough to save him. So, I did the only thing a mother, pushed to the absolute edge of her soul, could do. I had him arrested. But before that final, unforgivable violation, before that last desperate act of tough love, there were years of smaller betrayals. A slow, heartbreaking erosion of the boy I once knew, 1,000 little cuts that slowly and then all at once bled me dry. My name is Amanda, and I am 68 years old. For the last 5 years, since my husband Frank passed from this world, my life has been a quiet, lonely vigil. A vigil for the man I had lost, and a vigil for the son who was lost in a different way. Frank was the love of my life, the steady, warm center of my world. His passing had left a hole in my heart that I knew would never truly heal. Our son, Leo, had been 17 then. He was a good boy, a bit wild, but with a good heart. Or so I believed. Frank's death broke something in him. It was as if the anchor that held him to the good and decent world had been cut, and he had been drifting ever since. My quiet life now had a predictable, painful rhythm. For a few days, there would be silence. I would putter around my small, tidy home, talking to the photograph of Frank on the mantelpiece, telling him about my day, about the garden. And then the phone would ring, or there would be a knock on the door, and it would be Leo. He came to me last Tuesday. He looked awful. At 22, he should have been full of life, but his eyes were dull and bloodshot, his skin pale, and he was so thin I could see the sharp angles of his bones beneath his dirty t-shirt. He was a ghost of the vibrant, laughing boy I had raised. "Hey, Mama," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Leo, baby, what is it?" I asked, my heart doing its familiar, painful squeeze. The story was always the same, a different verse in the same sad song. He had a job interview, but his car had broken down. He had a line on a new apartment, but he needed a security deposit. He was just a few dollars short on his rent, and the landlord was going to kick him out. The lies were so thin, so worn from overuse, that they were practically transparent. But he would look at me with those big, sad eyes, the same eyes he'd had as a little boy, and the mother in me would betray the wiser, sadder woman who knew better. "I'm clean, Mama, I swear," he'd say, and it was the lie that hurt the most. "I'm really trying this time. If I can just get this one break, everything will change." I knew it wouldn't. I knew the $50 I would eventually give him. The $50 I couldn't really afford to lose from my own fixed income would not go to a landlord or a bus pass. I knew it would go to a cheap bottle of whiskey and the laughing, parasitic friends who were dragging him down into the gutter with them, but I would give it to him anyway. Because the hope that this time he was telling the truth was a more powerful drug than any substance he was abusing. He left that afternoon, $50 richer, his promises of a new beginning hanging in the air like smoke. I watched him go, a prayer on my lips, a stone in my heart. An hour later, as I was putting away my good silver after polishing it, I noticed a gap in the row of forks. One was missing, a single sterling silver dinner fork. It wasn't the most valuable thing in the world, but it was part of a set my own mother had given me for my wedding. I didn't have to wonder where it had gone. This was the tax I paid for my son's visits. After he would leave, something small would be gone. A decorative pin from my jewelry box, a pair of my late husband's cufflinks, small, deniable thefts. If I ever dared to ask him, he would look at me with a wounded, childlike innocence. "No, Mama, how could you even think that? You must have just misplaced it." And I, a willing accomplice in my own deception, would pretend to believe him. I would tell myself I was just getting forgetful. But that evening, as I set the table for my solitary dinner with one less fork, something felt different. The thefts were becoming more brazen. The lies were becoming more desperate. I looked at the photograph of my Frank, his kind, steady gaze looking back at me. "What do I do, Frank?" I whispered to the silent image. "What do I do with our boy? I'm losing him." I went to bed that night with a deep, unsettling dread in my heart. I didn't know it then, but I was right to be afraid. Because my son, my lost boy, was about to escalate his war against me, against himself. He was about to steal something so personal, so sacred, that it would finally and completely shatter the heart of the mother who had done nothing but forgive him. The empty space on my late husband's nightstand where his watch had been was a silent, screaming accusation. For days, I lived with the knowledge of the theft, a cold, hard stone in my gut. I didn't confront Leo. I was a coward. I was afraid of the lie he would tell, and even more afraid of the truth I already knew. So I said nothing, and my silence was a form of permission, a quiet signal to my son that the boundaries of my love and my home were endlessly elastic. I tried to convince myself that he had just borrowed it, that he would bring it back. I would clean the house and pretend to be looking for it. A sad, one-woman show for an audience of none. The self-deception was exhausting. Then about a week later he reappeared. Not with a desperate, hungover plea for money, but with a lawnmower. He showed up on a Saturday morning, his eyes clearer than I'd seen them in months, and he simply started mowing my lawn. He spent the entire day doing yard work, trimming the hedges, pulling weeds, his movements filled with a quiet, purposeful energy. That afternoon he came inside, smelling of fresh-cut grass and sweat, and he looked me in the eye. "I'm sorry, Mama," he said, his voice quiet and sincere. "I know I've been a mess. I've been a bad son, but I'm done with that life. I'm going to enroll in a class at the community college next month. I'm going to make you and Dad proud." The hope that surged through me was a physical force, so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet. This was it. The prayer I had whispered into the darkness every single night was finally being answered. My son was coming back to me. I wrapped him in a hug, tears of pure, unadulterated relief streaming down my face. I made him his favorite dinner, pot roast, and as we sat at the kitchen table for the first time in years, it felt like we were a family again. When he left that evening, I pressed $200 into his hand. "For your textbooks," I said, my heart overflowing with a love that was blind, deaf, and utterly foolish. The hope lasted for 3 beautiful, glorious days. On the 4th day, I came home from my weekly grocery run to find my back door slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I crept inside, my hands trembling, and I saw the truth. My small, old television was gone from its stand. The microwave was missing from the counter. A box containing the few pieces of my mother's silver that I owned was gone from the dining room sideboard. This was not the work of a stranger. There was no forced entry. This was the work of someone with a key. Someone I had given $200 to for textbooks just a few days before. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that I could not even cry. I just stood in the middle of my violated home, a cold, empty numbness spreading through me. I called him. His phone rang and rang before he finally picked up, his voice thick with a fake, sleepy confusion. "Mama?" "What's wrong?" "Someone broke into the house, Leo?" I said, my voice a dead, flat monotone. "They took the television." "And the microwave, and Grandma's silver." "What?" he said, his performance of shock and concern a masterpiece of deception. "Oh my God, Mama, are you okay? Did you call the police?" "It must have been those kids from the next neighborhood over, I'm telling you." "Don't lie to me, Leo," I said, the numbness in my voice finally cracking to reveal the raw, wounded rage beneath. "Don't you dare lie to me." The back door wasn't forced. They had a key. "Who has a key to my house, Leo?" "Who?" The line went silent. And then I heard him break. It was not the sound of remorse. It was the pathetic, sniveling sound of a coward who'd been caught. "I'm sorry, Mama," he sobbed. "I owed some people money. Some bad people. They were going to hurt me. I had to do it. I was scared he was still the victim. He was always the victim. His pain, his fear, his needs, they were the only things that were real in his world. My pain, my fear, my loss, they were just collateral damage." "Just stay away from me, Leo," I said, my voice hollow. "Just stay away." I hung up the phone and with trembling hands I called a locksmith. That evening, as a kind, silent man changed the locks on all my doors, I felt the final tragic irony of my situation. I was a 68-year-old woman turning my own home into a prison to protect myself from my own child. A few weeks of blessed, anxious silence followed. He didn't call. He didn't come by. I told myself it was for the best. I told myself this was the boundary I needed to hold. But the silence was a torment, filled with a mother's worst fears. One night I went to bed, my body aching with a loneliness that felt like a physical illness. I performed my nightly ritual, the one I had shared with Frank for so many years. I took out my partial dentures and placed them in the cleaning solution in the glass on my nightstand. I looked at them, at the 3 small golden teeth that glinted in the soft light of my bedside lamp. Frank had insisted on them just a month before he passed. "Let them be a little reminder of me," he had whispered, his voice weak. "Even if everything else is gone, you'll still have a little piece of my love to bite down on." I looked at those 3 gold teeth shining in the glass. They weren't just gold. They were a promise. They were a memory. They were the one thing in this world I truly believed was safe. I put the glass on the nightstand, turned off the light, and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, completely unaware that the wolf was no longer at the door. He was already inside the house. I slept that night with the false sense of security that new locks on a door can bring. I believed, with a foolish and desperate hope, that a barrier of metal and steel could protect me from a monster who had been living inside my own heart for years. I don't know what time he came. I don't know how he got in. An old forgotten key he'd had copied years ago? A loose window latch in the basement he remembered from his teenage years? It doesn't matter. A wolf who has been raised in the sheep pen knows all of its weaknesses. I slept the deep, exhausted sleep of a woman who had given up, and while I slept, he moved through the silent house, a ghost of the son I had once known. He did not touch the silver. He did not take the small amount of cash I had in my purse. He came for something much more valuable. The next morning, I woke to the gentle sunlight streaming through my bedroom window. For a blissful, ignorant moment, it was just an ordinary day. I sat up, the familiar aches of my 68-year-old body a steady rhythm to my morning. I reached for the glass on my nightstand, my fingers closing around the cool, familiar shape of my dentures. I brought them to my mouth, but something was wrong. They felt different, lighter, unbalanced. I pulled them back and held them in the palm of my hand, and then I saw it. The 3 empty, jagged sockets in the pink acrylic. The 3 gaping holes where the small, shining pieces of my husband's last gift had been, the gold was gone. A sound, a choked, strangled gasp that was more animal than human, escaped my lips. I stared at the mutilated piece of plastic in my hand, my mind refusing to process the reality of the violation. He had been in my room. While I slept, just a few feet away, he had stood over me. He had reached out his hand, his son's hand, and he had taken the glass. He had worked the gold teeth out of their setting, a quiet, ghoulish act of desecration in the dead of night. I collapsed from the bed onto the floor, the mutilated dentures clutched in my hand, and the last stubborn and foolish vestiges of my hope for him finally and completely died. This was not a boy who had lost his way. This was not a sickness that could be cured with a mother's love. This was a ghoul, a grave robber who had plundered the last sacred memory of his own father to fund another night of cheap whiskey and laughter with his worthless friends. I thought of Frank's face, his kind, gentle face in those last painful weeks. I remembered his hand, weak but still warm, pressing the newly fitted dentures into mine. "Let them be a little reminder of me, Amanda," he had whispered, "even if everything else is gone." And my son, my own flesh and blood, had stolen that last reminder. He had violated not just my home, not just my trust, but the sacred memory of the man who had given him life. I sat on the floor of my bedroom in a pool of morning sunlight, and the storm inside me was not one of sadness. The tears were gone. The endless, bottomless well of a mother's forgiveness had finally, after years of being plundered, run dry. The grief for the boy he had been was replaced by a cold, hard, and terrifying clarity about the man he had become. And I looked at my own reflection in this terrible act, my enabling, my forgiveness, my refusal to see the truth. It had not been love. It had been a form of poison. My weakness had been the soil in which his monstrosity had been allowed to grow. And in that moment, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in the barren wasteland of my heart. It was not rage. It was colder, calmer, and infinitely more powerful. It was resolve. I knew with an absolute and unshakable certainty what I had to do. If I did not stop him now, he would either end up dead in a ditch or he would put someone else there. I had already buried a husband. I would not bury a son. And I would not live to see him become a murderer. Slowly, deliberately, I stood up. My movements were no longer the frail, uncertain movements of a grieving old woman. They were the steady, purposeful movements of a woman on a mission. I walked to my closet and I got dressed. Not in my usual comfortable house dress, but in my Sunday best, the simple, dignified, dark blue dress I wore to church. It was the armor of a respectable woman, a woman who was about to do the most difficult and unrespectable thing a mother can do. I took the mutilated dentures, wrapped them carefully in a clean white handkerchief, and placed them in my purse. They were no longer a memory. They were evidence. I walked out of my house, locking the new deadbolt behind me, a lock that had failed to protect me. I got in my car. I did not drive to my sister's house for comfort. I did not drive to my church for guidance. I drove with a calm and terrible certainty, straight to the downtown police precinct. The unconditional love of a mother had failed to save my son. Now, it was time to see what the cold, unforgiving love of the law could do. The police precinct was a world of harsh, unforgiving reality. The air smelled of stale coffee, disinfectant, and a low-grade simmering despair. I sat on a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, a 68-year-old woman in a dark blue church dress clutching my purse to my chest. I was an anomaly, a quiet, grieving widow in a place built for the loud, violent, and broken. People stared, but I did not see them. My focus had narrowed to a single, terrible point of purpose. After what felt like an eternity, my name was called. I was led back to a small, cluttered office where a man in a rumpled suit sat behind a metal desk. He was a detective, a man named Miller, with tired, kind eyes that had clearly seen the worst of what people were capable of doing to each other. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a gentle, weary rumble, "the desk sergeant said you had a theft to report." I sat down in the chair opposite him, my posture ramrod straight. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "My son. I am here to report my son." For the next hour, I told him everything. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I recounted the story of the last 5 years of my life with a cold, clinical precision. I told him about the slow, painful spiral after my husband's death, about the escalating thefts, the lies, the manipulation. I told him about the television, the silver, my husband's watch. Throughout it all, he listened patiently, his expression a mask of professional sympathy. This was, I was sure, just another sad, familiar story of a family torn apart by addiction and bad choices. "And last night," I said, my voice finally beginning to tremble, "he came into my home while I was sleeping." I opened my purse, took out the white handkerchief, and carefully unwrapped the mutilated dentures. I placed them on the desk between us. "He took these from a glass on my nightstand," I said, "and he pried out the 3 gold teeth. They were the last gift my husband ever gave me." Detective Miller stared at the pathetic, violated object on his desk. The professional mask fell away, replaced by a look of profound human shock and disgust. He has seen a lot of ugly things in his career, but this was a special kind of desecration. He looked up at me, his gaze full of a new deep respect. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this, Mrs. Johnson?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Once we file this report, once we issue a warrant, the wheels of the system start turning." "It's a very hard thing to stop, I know," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "I'm not doing this to punish him, detective. My son is drowning, and my love has been the water filling his lungs. I'm doing this because it's the only thing left that might save his life." I signed the statement, my hand surprisingly steady. The formal complaint listed the charges: burglary of an occupied dwelling, grand larceny, and a special charge for elder abuse. It was a long and ugly list of my own son's crimes against me. The police acted with a swift and terrible efficiency. They knew the flop houses, the dingy bars, the street corners where boys like Leo went to disappear. They found him less than 3 hours later in a dark, smoky pool hall on the edge of a bad neighborhood, laughing with his friends, my husband's gold already traded for a pocket full of cash and a night of cheap thrills. He did not put up a fight. The report said he was drunk, that he started crying the moment he saw the uniforms, begging them to call his mama. His friends, the ones for whom he had committed his final soul-destroying sin, had scattered like cockroaches in the light. He was arrested, alone, and pathetic. The phone rang late that afternoon. I was sitting in my silent, empty kitchen, staring at a wall, when the caller ID showed the police precinct's number. It was Detective Miller. "Mrs. Johnson, he said, his voice full of a quiet, weary respect, I just wanted to let you know. We have him in custody. He's been processed and he's spending the night in a holding cell. Thank you, Detective, I said, my voice a hollow whisper. I hung up the phone. It was done. The most difficult, most unnatural, most heartbreaking act of my entire life was complete. I sat there in the gathering twilight, a 68-year-old woman who had just sent her only child, her own flesh and blood, to jail. I had finally stopped being his enabler and had become his consequence. And I had never, in my entire life, felt so completely and utterly alone. The first few days after Leo's arrest were a study in profound and absolute loneliness. The house, which had been a chaotic source of anxiety for so long, was now a tomb. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on me. There were no more phone calls begging for money, no more unexpected knocks on the door, no more fear of finding something missing. The constant low-grade crisis that had defined my life for 5 years was over, and I had never been more miserable. The social fallout began on the third day. The news, as it always does in a tight-knit community, had traveled fast. My sister Clara was the first to call. "Amanda, what in the name of God have you done?" she asked, her voice a shrill, horrified whisper. "Mildred from down the street called me. She said she saw a police car at your house, that they arrested Leo." "Tell me it's not true." "It's true, Clara," I said, my voice flat. "But he's your son. Your own flesh and blood. You don't do that to family. You don't air your dirty laundry for the whole world to see. What will people think?" I have spent the last 5 years worrying about what people think, I said, a new hard edge to my voice that surprised even me. And all it has gotten me is a broken heart and an empty house. I am done worrying about what people think. I am trying to save my son's life. I hung up on her sputtering protests. Her judgment, her concern for appearances over the brutal reality of the situation was a luxury I could no longer afford. The day of the arraignment arrived, a cold, gray morning that matched the state of my soul. I went to the courthouse alone. I sat in the back row of the grim, impersonal courtroom, a solitary 68-year-old woman in a world of public defenders and petty criminals. I watched as they brought my son in. He was wearing a baggy orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled in front of him. He looked pale, thin, and utterly terrified. The sight of him, my boy, in chains, was a physical blow that almost made me cry out. This was real. I had done this. The judge took the bench, a distinguished, gray-haired man in his late 60s. He began to read the docket, his voice a low, bored monotone, and then he read the names of our case. The People versus Leo Johnson. Complainant, Amanda Johnson. He looked up, his eyes scanning the courtroom, and his gaze landed on me. A flicker of recognition, of pained surprise crossed his features, and in that moment, I recognized him too. It was Robert Jackson. Bobby Jackson. We had been in the same graduating class at Cass Tech all those years ago. He had been a friend of my Frank's. He had been to our house for dinner. The public humiliation of my family's tragedy was now being presided over by a man who had once known us as a happy, hopeful young couple. The proceedings were a blur. The charges were read. Leo's public defender entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecutor argued that, given the nature of the crime, a residential burglary against his own elderly mother, Leo was a danger and should be held on a high bail. It was then that the judge did something unexpected. He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice now filled with a quiet judicial gravity. "This is a deeply unfortunate and unusual situation. Before I rule on the matter of bail, I would like to hear from you." I stood up, my legs trembling. Every eye in the small courtroom was on me. I looked at my son, at his pale, frightened face, and then I looked at my old classmate, at the man who held my son's future in his hands. Your Honor, I began, my voice a shaking whisper that grew stronger with every word, I am not here today to see my son punished. The world has punished him, and he has punished himself more than I could ever imagine. I took a deep breath. I am here because I love him. And I believe that the path he is on will lead directly to his death, or to the death of someone else. I am asking this court not for vengeance. I am asking for salvation. He doesn't need a cell, Your Honor. He needs structure. He needs discipline. He needs a place where he can be rebuilt from the ruins of his life. My eyes locked with Judge Jackson's, and I delivered the final, desperate plea of a mother at the end of her rope. I didn't bring my son here to be punished, I said. I brought him here to be saved. The judge was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on me. He looked at Leo, then back at me, a deep, sad understanding in his eyes. Mr. Johnson, he finally said, his voice booming in the silent courtroom. Your mother has just given you a gift more valuable than any freedom I could grant you today. I suggest you do not waste it. He denied the prosecutor's request for a high bail, but he also denied the public defender's request for release. He remanded Leo to custody, pending a full psychiatric and substance abuse evaluation, and he made a note on the file to recommend the state's most rigorous and well-respected long-term rehabilitation program upon sentencing. They led Leo away. As he passed the row where I was sitting, his head was down, but he glanced up at me for a fraction of a second. The anger I had expected to see was gone, replaced by a look of profound, dawning shock. He had just heard his own mother, the woman he had so cruelly betrayed, declare her unconditional and desperate love for him in the most public and painful way imaginable. I watched them take my son away in chains. The quiet victory I had won felt exactly like heartbreak. The long, lonely war for his soul had only just begun. The weeks between the arraignment and the sentencing were a form of purgatory. I was in a holding pattern, a 68-year-old woman waiting for a judge to formalize the terms of her son's exile. The initial reports from Leo's court-ordered evaluations were a brutal confirmation of everything I had feared. They spoke in the cold clinical language of a system that had seen thousands of boys like him. Severe substance abuse disorder, unresolved grief, a pattern of manipulative and antisocial behavior. Reading the report felt like reading my own failure as a mother, written down in black and white. On the day of the sentencing, I returned to the same courtroom, to the same seat in the back row. This time, the room felt different. It was not a place of conflict, but of consequence. Leo was brought in. He had been in county jail for almost a month, and the change was already visible. The toxic, drug-fueled haze was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary, and sober sadness. He looked thin, young, and terribly lost. He saw me sitting in the back, and he quickly looked away, his face a mask of profound shame. Judge Jackson presided with a solemn gravity. He had read the reports. He had read my victim impact statement, in which I had once again pleaded not for punishment, but for a chance at rehabilitation for my son. He spoke directly to Leo, his voice echoing in the silent, wood-paneled room. Mr. Johnson, he began, his gaze hard and unyielding. I look at the reports in front of me and I see a story of squandered opportunity. A story of a young man who was given every advantage and chose to throw it all away in a fit of self-pity and addiction. I see the pain you have caused, the laws you have broken, and the trust you have shattered. He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he glanced at me. But I also see a statement from your mother. a woman you have wronged in ways that this court can barely comprehend. And that statement is not a call for vengeance. It is a prayer for your salvation. This court is not in the business of granting salvation, son. That is work you will have to do for yourself. But what we can do is provide you with the place and the opportunity to begin that work. The sentence came down, not as a punishment, but as a prescription. I sentence you to a term of 2.5 years at the North Ridge Correctional and Rehabilitation Center. It is not a standard prison, Mr. Johnson. It is a working farm, it is a trade school, and it is a place of brutally hard, honest labor. There will be no excuses and no easy ways out. It will be the hardest thing you have ever done. It is, in all likelihood, your last chance. Do not waste it. As the bailiffs came to lead him away, Leo stopped. He turned and looked directly at me. The anger and resentment I had feared I would see were gone. In their place was a look of such deep, heartbreaking sorrow and shame that it almost brought me to my knees. It was a silent, desperate apology, a final acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. And then he was gone. I returned to my home, a house that was now officially, and for the foreseeable future, just a house for one. The legal battle was over. My son was gone. And the long, quiet, and lonely war of waiting had begun. My life settled into a new monastic routine. I cut off the family members, like my sister Clara, who had judged my decision. I did not have the strength for their shallow, self-righteous pity. My days were marked by a single sacred ritual. Every evening, just as the sun began to set, I would light a single tall white candle and place it on the mantelpiece, in front of the large, framed photograph of my dear Frank. I would speak to him, my voice a low murmur in the quiet house. I told him about my day, I told him about the garden, and I always told him about Leo. I prayed for his safety. I prayed for his strength. And I prayed that the hard, cold love I had shown him would be the thing that finally, after all these years, brought our son back home to us. The months bled into one another. The house was quiet. My life was quiet. I received no letters from the facility. I did not expect them. Part of the program at North Ridge was a long initial period of no contact with the outside world, a time to break the old patterns and dependencies. But the silence was a constant, heavy presence, a blank space where my hope and my fear wrestled every single day. One evening, about a year into his sentence, as I stood before my husband's photograph, the flickering candlelight casting a warm glow on his kind, smiling face, the silence in the house felt particularly deep, particularly lonely. I looked at the man I had loved, the man whose last gift had been the catalyst for this whole terrible ordeal, and I whispered the same 2 questions I asked him every single night. Did I do the right thing, Frank? Will our son ever forgive me? And every single night, the quiet, unwavering silence was the only answer I received. 1.5 years, 18 months, 547 days. I measured my life in the slow, quiet rhythm of lonely nights and solitary mornings. The silence from the North Ridge Rehabilitation Center was absolute. My son, Leo, had vanished from my life, and the only proof that he still existed was the ache in my own heart. My life settled into a new, quieter shape. I had found a fragile peace in routine. I tended to my garden with a meticulous care that bordered on obsession. I volunteered at the church library twice a week, the scent of old books and the quiet industry of the work a balm to my soul. The relatives who had judged me, like my sister Clara, had long since stopped calling. their disapproval a wall of silence I was grateful for. My world had become very small, but it was, for the first time in years, peaceful. But every evening without fail, my ritual remained. I would light the candle in front of Frank's photograph and I would talk to him. I would tell him about my day and I would ask the same two questions that had haunted me for 18 months. Did I do the right thing? And will he ever forgive me? And the silence was always my only reply. Then, one cool autumn afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was a simple, plain white one, but the return address, printed in stark, black letters, made my heart stop. Northridge C and R Center. My hands trembled so badly I could barely open it. I was terrified. Was it bad news? Had he gotten into a fight? Had he failed? Had he gotten into a fight? Had he failed? I sank into a kitchen chair, my breath held tight in my chest, and I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was not from Leo. The letter was from a man named Marcus Evans, who identified himself as Leo's primary mentor and work supervisor at the facility. The tone of the letter was direct, unsentimental, and brutally honest. "Dear Mrs. Johnson," it began, "I am writing to you today to provide a mandatory progress update on your son, Leo Johnson. I will not sugarcoat it. The first year of his residency here was exceptionally difficult. He was angry, resentful, and completely resistant to the program. He broke rules, he was insubordinate, and he refused to participate in his counseling sessions. He was, to be frank, one of the most difficult cases I have seen in my 15 years here. I had to stop reading. A wave of despair washing over me. I had been wrong. My terrible gamble had failed. I had sent my son to this place, and it had only made him harder, angrier. With a deep, shuddering breath, I forced myself to continue reading. Then, 6 months ago, something changed. We had an incident on the work farm. Another resident made a careless remark about Leo's father. Leo reacted, and there was a physical altercation. As a result, he was placed in solitary reflection for 3 days. It was in that time, alone, with no distractions, that something in him finally broke. When I went to see him, he was not the angry, defiant young man I had been dealing with for a year. He was just a boy, weeping with a grief so profound it was heartbreaking to witness. He was not grieving for himself. He was, for the first time, truly and completely grieving for his father. He spoke for hours about the man he had lost, the guilt he felt, and the anger at the world that he had been masking for 5 years with alcohol and drugs. That was his turning point. Since that day, Leo's transformation has been remarkable. He is sober. He is focused. He has become the hardest worker on my crew, learning carpentry with a natural skill that is impressive. He is attending his counseling sessions, and for the first time, he is being honest. He is confronting the man he was, and he is working to become a different one. I read the words over and over, tears of a kind I had not shed in years, tears of a fragile, cautious, and overwhelming joy streaming down my face. My prayer, my desperate, silent, nightly prayer had been answered. My choice had not been a mistake. The hard, cold, unforgiving love of the law had done what my soft, enabling, and bottomless love never could. It had saved him. I read the final paragraph of the letter through my blurred, tear-filled vision. He does not speak of you, Mrs. Johnson. When your name is mentioned in our sessions, he becomes very quiet and withdrawn. He carries a great deal of shame about the pain he has caused you, and he has a long way to go before he can confront it. However, I thought you should know. He keeps a small, worn photograph by his bunk. It is of you and his father from a long time ago. It is the only personal item he has. P.S. As of next month, he will have earned the privilege of a single supervised family visit. It is his choice and his alone whether or not to request one. The ball is in his court. I folded the letter, my hands still trembling, but with hope now, not fear. A photograph. In the middle of his own personal hell, he had kept a photograph of us. The long, silent war was not over, but for the first time in 18 months I had received a sign from the other side, and all I could do now was wait and pray that my son would find the courage to want to see his mother's face again. The mentor's letter became a sacred text to me. I read it every single day. His blunt, honest words, a source of a hope so fragile I was almost afraid to touch it. My life, which had been a static, gray landscape of waiting, was now filled with a new, sharp, and painful anticipation. Every day, when the mailman came, my heart would give a hopeful, painful lurch. And every day when there was no letter from Leo, the quiet disappointment was a small, fresh wound. Weeks turned into a month and then 2. The beautiful autumn leaves fell from the trees, and the first hints of a cold Michigan winter began to creep into the air. The silence from North Ridge was absolute. The initial, soaring hope that Mr. Evans's letter had given me began to fray at the edges, worn thin by the relentless, grinding passage of time. The old doubts, the ones that whispered to me in the lonely hours of the night, began to return. Had I been a fool to hope? Had his progress been a temporary fluke? Maybe his shame was too great, his anger at me too deep. Maybe he would serve his time, walk out of that facility, and I would never see or hear from him again. The thought of a future where my son existed in the world but not in my life was a cold and terrifying prospect. I was in my garden pulling up the last of my frostbitten tomato plants when the mail carrier dropped a small stack of letters into my mailbox. I walked over, my expectations low, and I sorted through the usual bills and junk mail. And then I saw it. A plain white envelope with the North Ridge return address in the corner. But the handwriting on the front, the familiar, slightly messy scrawl that I had not seen in almost 2 years, was his. My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to tremble. I walked back into the house, the unopened letter clutched in my hand as if it were a live bird. I did not open it right away. I went to my quiet, sunlit living room and sat in my armchair, the one across from the mantelpiece where Frank's photograph stood. I needed his strength for this. I needed his calm, steady presence to face whatever was inside this envelope. Finally, with a prayer on my lips, I tore it open. The letter inside was not long. It was written on a single sheet of simple lined paper, the words of a man who was still learning how to be honest. "Mom," it began, "Mr. Evans said I should write. He says it's part of the process. I am not good at this. I am not good at words. I have been sober for 6 months. I work in the wood shop every day. I am strong. I have thought a lot about what the judge said, about you giving me a gift. For a long time I thought he was crazy. I was so angry at you, but I am not angry anymore. I was the one who was sick, and you did what you had to do. I think about what I did every single day. I think about Dad's watch. I think about Grandma's silver, and I think about the last thing. The thing from your room. I live with the shame of it every single second. I don't know how you can ever look at my face again. Mr. Evans says I have earned a visit. I don't know if I have earned the right to see you, but I am asking now. If you are willing, I would like to see my mother, your son, Leo. The relief was a tidal wave. It washed over me, through me, a cleansing, healing flood that washed away 2 years of fear and doubt. He wanted to see me. He was confronting his shame. He had called himself my son. I wept. my tears soaking the precious, tear-stained letter until there were no tears left to cry. Then I picked up the phone and made the call to schedule the visit. The week leading up to my trip to Northridge was a blur of nervous, hopeful energy. What would I say to him? What would he look like? Would he still be my boy? I baked his favorite cookies, a foolish, motherly gesture, a taste of a home he had tried so hard to destroy. The night before the visit, I was packing a small overnight bag. I knew I had to bring him something. Not the cookies, not a gift. Something more, something important. I went to the old wooden chest in my bedroom where I kept the family albums, the ones I hadn't had the heart to look at in years. I opened the top album, the one from when Leo was a little boy. And there it was. On the very first page, a photograph taken by Frank on a sunny afternoon in our old backyard. It was the three of us. Frank had his arm around me, and I was holding a 10-year-old Leo who was laughing, his face a perfect picture of innocent, uncomplicated joy. We were a family. We were whole. I carefully removed the old photograph from its plastic sleeve. This was the family he had destroyed. This was the family he had forgotten. And I was going to bring it with me, a quiet, powerful reminder, not just of what he had lost, but of what, if we were both strong enough, if the grace of God was with us, we might one day hope to rebuild. The drive to the Northridge Rehabilitation Center was a 3-hour journey north, a slow pilgrimage from the familiar streets of my city into the stark, rural landscape of the countryside. With every mile that passed, my anxiety grew, a tight, fluttering bird in my chest. What would I find there? A harder, angrier version of my son, or a stranger I no longer knew? The facility was not what I had expected. It was not a place of fences and guard towers. It was a sprawling working farm with simple, clean-lined wooden buildings and vast, open fields that stretched to the horizon. It was a place of stark, beautiful, and unforgiving simplicity. It was a place where a man could either find himself or be completely and utterly broken by the hard, honest work of the land. I was led to the visitors' common room, a Spartan space with a few simple tables and chairs, the air smelling of floor wax and fresh brewed coffee. A large man with a kind, weathered face and a firm handshake introduced himself as Marcus Evans, Leo's mentor. He spoke to me for a few minutes, his words a quiet confirmation of his letter. Leo was working. He was sober, but he was Mr. Evans warned me, in a fragile and precarious place. And then the door opened, and they brought my son in. The young man who walked into the room was a stranger. The ghost I had last seen, the pale, haunted boy with the dull, drug-addled eyes, was gone. This man was lean and hard, his shoulders broadened by 2 years of farm labor, his hands calloused and capable-looking. His face was thinner, older, and there were new lines around his eyes. But his eyes were clear. For the first time in 5 years, they were completely, startlingly clear. The initial moments were a landscape of pure, painful awkwardness. He sat across from me, his gaze fixed on the scarred surface of the table between us. I didn't know what to say. He didn't know where to begin. Mr. Evans, with a quiet, understanding nod, left us alone. We spoke of small, safe things at first. I told him about my garden. He told me about learning to work in the wood shop, a flicker of pride in his voice as he described the tables and chairs he had learned to build. And then he finally looked up and met my gaze. The shame in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "Mom," he began, his voice a hoarse, cracking whisper, "the things I did, the things I took from you, from Dad's memory." He shook his head, unable to continue. "It's in the past, Leo," I said softly. "No, it's not," he said, his voice gaining a new, hard strength. "It will never be in the past. It is something I will carry with me every single day for the rest of my life. I can't give you back what I stole, but I can say I'm sorry. From the bottom of my soul, Mom, I am so sorry. The apology was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a simple, honest statement of fact. It was the confession of a man who had finally and completely come to terms with the magnitude of his own sins. I reached into my purse and took out the old photograph, its corners soft with age. I slid it across the table toward him. "I brought you something," I said. He picked it up. It was the picture of the three of us in the backyard a lifetime ago. A happy, laughing 10-year-old boy held between the two parents who adored him. He stared at the photograph, at the ghost of the family he had destroyed, and he finally, completely broke. His head fell into his hands and he began to weep. It was not the pathetic, manipulative sobbing I had seen before. It was the sound of a man's heart breaking open, a raw, ragged, and utterly devastating sound of pure, cleansing grief. He wept for his father, he wept for his lost youth, and he wept for the mother he had so cruelly betrayed. I moved to the chair beside him and put my arm around his shaking shoulders. I held my son, my real son, the one who had been lost for so long, and I let him cry. In that simple, shared moment of grief, the vast, silent chasm that had separated us for 2 long years finally began to close. We were not a broken woman and a convict. We were a mother and her son, finding our way back to each other in the wreckage. The hour was over all too soon. As the guard came to lead him away, Leo stood and faced me. He was still my son, but for the first time he was also a man. A man who was taking responsibility for his own life. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "When no one else did. Especially me. I will never give up on you, Leo," I said, my own voice a fierce, loving promise. "Never. You do the work. You get yourself well. And when you get out of here, your home is waiting for you." I watched him walk away, his back straight, his shoulders squared. He was still a prisoner of the state, his debt to society not yet paid. But as I saw the new, quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, I knew the truth. His real prison, the one of rage and grief and addiction that he had been trapped in for 5 long years, had finally and for good set him free. My visit to Northridge was a turning point, the moment when the fragile, theoretical hope for my son's recovery became a tangible, living thing. The man I had met in that visitor's room was not the boy I had lost, and he was not the monster he had become. He was someone new, someone being carefully and painstakingly rebuilt from the ground up. The final year of his sentence was different from the agonizing silence that had preceded it. We began to write to each other, our letters a slow, careful, and sometimes awkward bridge being built across the chasm of our shared pain. We did not dwell on the past. The apologies had been made, the forgiveness given. To constantly revisit the wound would be to prevent it from healing. Instead, we spoke of the present. He wrote to me about his work in the wood shop, his descriptions of the grain of a piece of oak or the satisfying heft of a well-made joint filled with a craftsman's quiet pride. He told me about the books he was reading from the facility's small library, about the brutal, beautiful work of the farm. I, in turn, wrote to him about my garden, about the changing seasons, about the funny thing a neighbor had said. We were 2 strangers, getting to know each other again, our letters the small, careful bricks with which we were laying the foundation for a new kind of relationship. 6 months before his scheduled release, a large square package arrived for me. The return address was from the Northridge wood shop. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, was a small, exquisitely crafted jewelry box. It was made of polished cherry and oak, with a delicate hand-carved pattern of roses on the lid. It was a thing of profound and perfect beauty. Tucked inside was a small folded note. "Mom," it read, "for all the treasures you have. I promise I will never take anything from you again except for your forgiveness, which you have already given me. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it. Love, Leo." I sat at my kitchen table, my hand resting on the smooth, warm wood of the box my son had made for me. He who had stolen from me, who had taken and taken until there was nothing left, was now giving. He who had destroyed was now creating. The tears that came were not tears of sorrow, but of a deep, cleansing, and overwhelming gratitude. My son was not just sober, he was healing. As the date of his release grew closer, I began to prepare my home and myself for his return. This was not the act of the old, enabling Amanda. I was not creating a soft, easy place for a troubled boy to fall back into his old ways. I was preparing a home for a man who would need both support and boundaries. I turned the old, cluttered spare room, the room that had once been his teenage den of angst, into a simple, clean, and dignified bedroom. I bought a new bed, a solid desk, and a good reading lamp. It was a space that offered not just comfort, an invitation to stay. I also did my own work. I found a support group for families of addicts, a small circle of wise, tough women who had all walked the same fiery path I had. They taught me the difference between helping and enabling. They taught me the language of healthy boundaries, the importance of letting the person you love be responsible for their own recovery. I was not just preparing my house for him. I was preparing myself to be the mother he needed now, not the one he had so easily manipulated before. A month before his release, a final letter arrived from Mr. Evans, his mentor. It was a formal discharge summary detailing his completion of every program, his exemplary work record, and his 2 years of uninterrupted sobriety. But at the bottom, Mr. Evans had added a personal, handwritten note. "He's a different man, Mrs. Johnson," he wrote. "One of the best I've ever seen come through here. But the world outside our gates is full of the same old ghosts and the same old temptations. He's strong, but he will need a foundation to stand on when the wind blows. It seems to me, after all you've been through, that you've become a pretty strong foundation yourself. I have high hopes for you both." The day of his release finally came. I drove the 3 hours north, my heart a fluttering mix of joy, hope, and a deep, gut-level nervousness. Had it all been real? Was the change permanent? I pulled up to the main gate of the North Ridge facility, and I saw him standing just outside, a single worn duffel bag at his feet. He looked older than his 24 years. He was lean, strong, and his face was tanned from 2.5 years of working under the sun. He stood with a quiet, patient stillness. He stood by the gate, a free man looking small against the vast open sky. The angry, lost boy I had sent away was gone. The man who stood before me had been completely and totally rebuilt from the inside out. Now came the hardest part. Now we had to see if the new foundation he had built was strong enough to withstand the weight of the world. He threw his single duffel bag in the back of my car, and we began the long, quiet drive home. The first few minutes were a landscape of awkward, unspoken emotion. He was a stranger in my car, a man I was getting to know all over again. He stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the passing fields and forests, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his seat. I realized with a pang of empathy that the simple speed of a car on a highway, the sheer freedom of the open road, must have been a terrifying and overwhelming sensation after 2.5 years of a life lived at a walking pace, within the confines of a fence. It was Leo who broke the silence, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I'm scared, Mom," he confessed, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. Out there. It's all still waiting for me. The old neighborhood, the bars, the people I used to know. They're all still there, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to say no. The old Amanda, the enabler, would have rushed in with a flood of easy, meaningless reassurances. Of course you're strong enough, baby. You can do anything. But the woman who sat behind the wheel of the car now was different. She had learned the hard lessons of boundaries and the true nature of support in her weekly meetings with the other mothers, the other wives, the other women who had loved an addict. You don't have to be strong enough for the rest of your life, Leo, I said, my voice calm and steady. You just have to be strong enough to get through today. And you're not alone in this fight anymore. You have me. You have Mr. Evans on the other end of the phone. And you have a plan. We spent the next hour talking about that plan, the strict daily routine he had worked out with his mentor, the carpentry jobs he was going to look for, the list of sobriety meetings he had in his pocket, a shield against the temptations of the world. He was not the passive, drifting boy who had been dragged down by the current. He was a man who was actively and with great effort learning to swim against it. As we left the quiet countryside and began to enter the familiar, chaotic sprawl of the Detroit suburbs, I saw his body tense. His gaze was no longer fixed on the horizon, but darting from side to side, taking in the familiar, ghostly landmarks of his old life. He flinched as we passed a billboard advertising a cheap brand of whiskey. He looked away as we drove past a dingy corner bar, a place I knew he used to frequent, its windows dark and menacing even in the middle of the afternoon. The world, for him, was a minefield of memories and triggers, and he was taking his first tentative steps through it. When we finally pulled into the driveway of my small, quiet house, he just sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. This was the scene of his greatest crimes against me, the place he had violated time and time again. "It's okay, Leo," I said softly. "That was a different house. And you are a different man." "Welcome home," I let him inside. He was expecting, I think, to be given his old, messy teenage bedroom. Instead, I opened the door to the clean, simple, and dignified room I had prepared for him, the room of a man. He stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of the solid new bed, the sturdy desk, the reading lamp. He ran his hand over the smooth, sanded wood of the desk, the work of a fellow carpenter. I saw his eyes well up with tears. He didn't have to say anything. I understood. It was a gesture of respect, a nonverbal declaration of my faith in the man I believed he could become. That first evening was quiet and gentle. We had a simple dinner. We talked. And then, around 7 o'clock, he stood up from the table, his expression a mixture of resolve and a deep, gut-wrenching nervousness. "Mom," he said, his voice a little shaky, I have to go out for a while." My heart stopped. The old familiar fear, a feeling I had prayed I would never feel again, seized me with its icy grip. So soon? Was this it? Was the sober, focused man I had picked up just hours ago already gone, replaced by the ghost who was headed back to the bars, back to the gutter? I must have looked terrified because he quickly added, his eyes full of a new and desperate honesty, "It's okay, Mom. I promise. I'll be back in an hour. Please. You have to trust me." It was the hardest test of my new resolve. My every instinct screamed to beg him to stay, to lock the door, to protect him from the world and from himself. But the wise women from my support group had taught me this lesson well. He had to choose his own recovery. I could not choose it for him. "Okay, Leo," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "I'll see you in an hour." I watched him walk out the front door into the dark night, and I waited. It was the longest hour of my life. He came back in 58 minutes. He walked into the kitchen where I was pretending to read a book, my heart pounding with every passing second. He didn't say a word. He just walked over to the kitchen table and placed a small, cheap plastic poker chip on the smooth wood. It was blue. He looked at me, and for the first time that day, a small, tired but genuine smile touched his lips. His eyes were clear and steady. "The first of many," he said. I looked down at the small, insignificant plastic disc. It was the most beautiful, most precious object I had ever seen. It was worth more to me than all the gold in the world. My son was not just home. He was fighting. He was winning. And I knew then that our real work, the work of healing, had truly and finally begun. The first few weeks of Leo's return were a quiet, delicate dance of building a new normal. Our house was no longer just my sanctuary. It was his base camp, the safe, solid ground from which he would begin his long, uphill climb back into the world. Our new routine was built around the architecture of his recovery. He was up every morning at dawn for a run. He attended a sobriety meeting every single day without fail. The rest of his day was a methodical, often frustrating job search. My role in this new life was different. I was no longer his enabler, his soft place to fall. I was his foundation. I provided a stable, sober home. I cooked healthy meals. I attended my own family support group meetings, learning the hard but necessary language of boundaries. I listened when he needed to talk, but I did not solve his problems. The old Amanda would have been on the phone, calling in favors, trying to find him a job. The new Amanda knew that his failures and his successes had to be his own. The world, I was reminded, does not easily forgive. The job search was a brutal, humbling experience for him. With a 5-year gap on his resume and a criminal record for burglary, the doors slammed shut in his face one after another. I would see him come home in the afternoons, the hope he had left, within the morning gone from his eyes, replaced by a familiar, weary frustration. It was in those moments that his sobriety was tested the most. The old Leo would have gone straight to a bottle. The new Leo would go to his room for an hour, and then he would emerge, quiet and somber, and he would help me in the garden or ask if there was anything in the house that needed fixing. It was in that question that he found his salvation. Frustrated with the world of resumes and interviews, he turned to the one thing he had truly learned at Northridge, the work of his own 2 hands. He started small. He repaired the creaky back step that had been bothering me for years. He built a set of beautiful, sturdy shelves for my books. The work was therapeutic. The clean, honest logic of wood and nails a comforting antidote to the messy, judgmental world outside. He was good at it. More than good. He had his grandfather's hands, a natural, intuitive skill for carpentry. The small, beautiful jewelry box he had made for me was not a fluke. One of my neighbors, an elderly woman who had seen him working in my yard, asked him if he could build her a small set of garden boxes. He did, and the work was flawless. She paid him, and he came home that evening with the first honest money he had earned in half a decade, a look of profound, quiet pride on his face. Word began to spread through the neighborhood. A man who did good work, who was reliable and charged a fair price, he started getting more small jobs. A new fence, a custom-built bookshelf, a repaired deck. He was piece by piece building not just furniture, but a new life, a new reputation. The biggest test came one afternoon when he was leaving the hardware store. A car pulled up beside him, and a man he had once called a friend, one of the ghosts from his old dark life, leaned out the window. The man was drunk, his eyes glassy, and he clapped Leo on the back with a loud, booming laugh. "Leo, my man, I heard you were back. We gotta celebrate for old time's sake. First round's on me. Leo told me about it that evening. His voice quiet, his hand still trembling slightly. He told me how for a split second the pull of the old life, the easy thoughtless numbness had been a physical force, a siren song. He had stood there, his old life on one side, his new, hard-won life on the other. I told him I wasn't that guy anymore, Leo said, his eyes meeting mine, and I walked away. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Mom. It was the strongest thing you have ever done, I said, my heart overflowing with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. A few weeks later, he came to me after dinner. He had been saving every dollar he had earned from his small carpentry jobs. He sat down at the kitchen table and pushed a piece of paper toward me. It was a detailed, technical drawing, a design for a new, top-of-the-line dental prosthetic. Mom, he said, his voice thick with a shame he was finally strong enough to face head-on. I know I can never, ever truly replace what I stole from you. I know I can't give you back the memory of Dad's last gift, but I want to try to make a different kind of memory. He looked at me, his eyes clear and full of a deep, unwavering resolve. I want to pay for this, for a new set, the best one they make. And I've been talking to a jeweler, a guy I met at one of my meetings. He said he could craft 3 small gold inlays for the plate, not teeth, just a design. Maybe 3 small stars, a symbol. It might take me a year to save up the money, but I'm going to do it. I need to do this, Mom. I need to make something beautiful to replace the ugly thing I did. I looked at my son, at the man he had become, a man who was offering to rebuild, piece by painful, honest piece, the very symbol of the trust he had so completely shattered. The gold he had stolen for a bottle of whiskey he now wanted to replace with the hard-earned wages of his own 2 hands. And I knew, in that moment, that our family's long, dark, and terrible night was finally over. The morning had truly come. The year that followed my son's promise was a masterclass in the quiet, steady, and often brutally difficult work of rebuilding a life from scratch. There were no miracles. There were only choices. Every single day, Leo chose sobriety. He chose work. He chose honesty. And I, in turn, chose to trust him, a day at a time, learning to replace the old familiar anxiety with a new and fragile hope. Leo's small word-of-mouth carpentry business began to grow. He was a true artist with wood, a skill that had been lying dormant in him, a gift from the grandfather he had never known. He poured all the obsessive energy he had once dedicated to his addiction into his craft. He worked from dawn until dusk in the small workshop he set up in my garage, the sound of a saw and the scent of sawdust replacing the long, empty silence that had once filled my home. He was not just building furniture, he was building a new identity, one planned smooth by hard work and polished with self-respect. Our relationship, too, was being rebuilt. It was a new and unfamiliar dance. The old roles, the enabling mother and the manipulative son, were gone, and in their place, 2 adults were slowly, carefully getting to know each other. I learned to give him his space, to respect his process, to be a supportive presence without becoming a crutch. He, in turn, learned to be open, to be honest about his struggles, to come to me not for a handout, but for a quiet conversation on the porch, when the ghosts of his past were whispering too loudly in his ear. He paid me a modest rent for his room and the use of the garage, a transaction that was never about the money but about the dignity it gave him. He was a tenant in my home, a man paying his own way, and in that simple, formal arrangement, we found a new and profound level of mutual respect. On the 1 year anniversary of his release from Northridge, he told me to put on my Sunday best. He announced, taking me out to dinner. He took me to a beautiful old Italian restaurant downtown, a place I had only ever read about in the society pages. He was dressed in a new sharp suit, looking handsome and healthy, and so full of a quiet, confident light that it took my breath away. He was not just my son. He was a fine and respectable man. He paid for the meal with a crisp $100 bill earned from the sale of a beautiful, handcrafted dining table he had just delivered to a client. As we waited for dessert, he grew quiet, a nervous, excited energy coming off him in waves. "Mom," he said, reaching into his suit pocket, "a year ago I made you a promise." He placed two things on the white tablecloth between us. The first was a simple white envelope. Inside was a paid-in-full receipt and a gift certificate from the best prosthodontist in Detroit. "For the new set," he said softly, "the best one they make." The second object was a small black velvet jeweler's box. He pushed it toward me. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, were 3 tiny, exquisitely crafted gold stars, so small and delicate they looked like fallen pieces of a constellation. "For when you're ready," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "to replace the ugly memory with something beautiful. The tears I shed then were not tears of pain or of sorrow. They were tears of a gratitude so immense, a pride so fierce, it felt like my heart would burst. The debt was paid. The ugly, gaping hole he had torn in our family's history had just been filled, not with a perfect, invisible mend, but with something far more beautiful, a scar that shone like gold. As we were leaving the restaurant, walking out into the cool night air, he took a deep, nervous breath. "There's one more thing, Mom," he said, stopping on the sidewalk. "My life. It's not just about the work and the meetings anymore. I've met someone." My heart gave a hopeful leap. "Her name is Sarah," he continued, a shy, happy smile transforming his face. "She's in my recovery group. She's smart, and she's kind, and she's wonderful. She knows my whole story, and she's not scared of it." He looked at me, his eyes full of a nervous, hopeful light I hadn't seen since he was a boy asking a girl to his first dance. I was wondering if it would be okay. If I could bring her over for Sunday dinner next week. I looked at my son, at the man he had become, a man who was not just rebuilding his own life, but who was brave enough to start building a new one with someone else. He was no longer just a man in recovery. He was a man with a future, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe that our little, broken family of 2 might just be ready and strong enough to grow again. The week leading up to that Sunday dinner was a joyous flurry of preparation. My house, which had been a quiet sanctuary for one, was about to become a home for a family again, however small. I cooked and cleaned with a lightness in my step I hadn't felt in years. This was not the anxious, obligatory hosting of a past life. This was an act of pure, hopeful love. I was not just preparing a meal, I was setting the table for my son's future. When the doorbell rang on Sunday afternoon, my heart was a nervous, happy drum. I opened the door, and there was my son, Leo, looking handsome and clean-cut, his eyes clear and full of a nervous pride. And beside him stood a woman with a warm, open face and a kind, intelligent smile. "Mom," Leo said, his voice full of a gentle formality, "this is Sarah." "Sarah? This is my mother, Amanda. It is an absolute honor to finally meet you, Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said, her handshake firm and her gaze direct. "I've heard so much about you." In that first moment, I knew. I saw in her eyes a quiet strength, a resilience that could only be earned by walking through a fire of her own. She was not a fragile girl my son had to rescue, nor a slick predator who would use him. She was a partner, a fellow survivor. The initial awkwardness of introductions quickly melted away in the warm, fragrant air of my kitchen. We did not talk of the dark past. We talked of the bright, hopeful present. Over the pot roast I had made, the same meal I had once eaten in a house full of ghosts, now shared in a home full of life, we began to build the first, fragile foundations of a new family. Sarah spoke openly and honestly about her own journey of recovery, about the counseling work she now did, helping other young women find their way out of the darkness. Leo, in her presence, was a man I had never seen before. He was confident, attentive, and so clearly, deeply in love. He spoke of his carpentry business, of his pride in his work, of his plans to one day open his own small shop. He was no longer a man defined by his failures. He was a man defined by his ambitions. I was no longer just his mother, the source of his pain and the object of his shame. I was the matriarch of this new, emerging family, a respected elder at a table filled with hope. I listened, I laughed, and I shared stories of my own new life, of my garden, of my friends from my support group. Later, as I was serving dessert, a simple apple pie, Sarah turned to me, her expression serious and full of a profound sincerity. "Leo has told me everything, Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "his whole story. And I just need to tell you, I think you are the strongest, bravest woman I've ever heard of. What you did for him, the choice you made, it wasn't just tough love. It was the purest, most terrifying act of real love I can imagine." Her words, this validation from the woman who now held my son's heart, were a final healing balm on the oldest and deepest of my wounds. The shame and doubt that had haunted me for years, the fear that I had been a bad mother, finally and completely dissolved. After dinner, as they were getting ready to leave, Leo and Sarah stood on my front porch, hand in hand. "Mom," Leo began, a nervous excitement in his voice, "Sarah and we've been talking. A lot. My business is doing well. I've saved up a good amount of money, and we found a small apartment just a few miles from here. We were thinking of getting it together." He looked at me, his eyes full of the question he was too afraid to ask. "Is this okay? Do I have your blessing to leave the nest again?" The joy that filled my heart was a pure, brilliant light. My son was not just surviving, he was thriving. He was ready to stand on his own 2 feet, to build his own home, to start his own family. My work, my long, painful, and loving work, was done. I stepped forward and pulled them both into a hug. "That's the most wonderful news I have ever heard," I said, my voice thick with happy tears. I stood on the porch and watched them walk to the car, 2 strong, good people ready to build a life of their own. For years, after Frank had died, my greatest fear had been the silence of an empty house. I had filled that silence with my son's chaos because I thought it was better than being alone. But now I understood. A home is not meant to be a container to keep your children in. It is meant to be a foundation, a strong, solid place from which they can launch themselves into their own lives. And the foundation I had built, forged in the fires of grief and tough love and a faith I never knew I had, was finally strong enough for my son to fly. 2 more years passed, each one a quiet, steady brick in the new foundation of our family. Leo and Sarah moved into their small apartment in town, and it was a joy to watch them build their life together. His carpentry business flourished, his reputation for honest work and beautiful craftsmanship growing with each piece he created. He was a man who had been completely broken, and he had patiently, with his own 2 hands, put himself back together, stronger and more beautiful than before. He was a living, breathing testament to the power of a second chance. Our Sunday dinners became a sacred ritual. Sometimes it was just the three of us. Other times our table would be crowded with the new family we had built, friends from our respective support groups, his sponsor, my dear friend, Ms. Davis, all of us a motley crew of survivors, bound together not by blood but by a shared understanding of the hard, beautiful work of healing. The day Leo and Sarah told me they were getting married, I was not surprised. I had seen the deep, quiet, and profound love between them, a love built not on fantasy, but on a clear-eyed acceptance of each other's scars. "We don't want a big wedding, Mom," Leo had told me, his hand holding Sarah's. "We just want something real, something quiet. We were wondering if we could get married in your garden?" And so, on a beautiful sun-drenched Saturday in September, my garden, the one I had nurtured from a place of loneliness and grief, became the stage for the most joyful day of my life. There were no crowds, no fancy caterers, just a handful of people who truly loved us. Mr. Evans, Leo's old mentor, drove down from North Ridge to be there. My sister Clara, who had long since apologized for her initial judgment, helped me arrange the flowers. I stood in my small, perfect garden, and I watched my son, my handsome, sober, and honorable son, marry the strong, wonderful woman who had become a daughter to me. I wore my new dentures, and when I smiled, the 3 small golden stars my son had given me glinted in the afternoon sun. They were not a replacement for the gift my dear Frank had given me. They were something more. They were a testament to a resurrection. During the ceremony, when it was time for them to say their vows, Leo turned to me. His eyes were clear, his voice thick with an emotion that was raw and true. "I have to thank my mother," he said, his words a surprise to everyone, including me. "She is the reason I am standing here today." When I was at my absolute worst, when I was a ghost, she loved me enough to do the hardest thing a parent can ever do. She loved me enough to let me go, to turn me over to a justice I had earned in the desperate hope that I could find my way back. She saved my life. He looked at me, his eyes full of a love and a gratitude that was my ultimate reward. "Thank you, Mom. For everything, the wedding was perfect. It was real, and it was a beginning." That evening, after the happy couple had left for their short honeymoon, I was sitting alone on my porch, the soft glow from the party lanterns still hanging in the trees. The house was quiet. My heart was full. I thought about the journey of the last few years, the dark, lonely nights, the soul-crushing despair, the terrible, agonizing choice I had been forced to make. The old Amanda, the woman who had lived in fear for so long, felt like a distant memory, a character from a sad story I had once read. The 3 gold teeth my husband had given me were gone forever, a memory of a deep and abiding love that had passed from this world. But the 3 gold stars my son had returned to me were something more. They were not a memory. They were a promise. They were a testament to a mother's love that had been strong enough not just to hold on but to let go. And as I sat there, in the peaceful, perfect silence of my own home, they shone with the brilliant, beautiful, and unending light of a future I had never, in my wildest dreams, dared to imagine.